The hawkishness continued on the response to the Israel-Hamas war, each candidate using violent rhetoric to pledge their support to Benjamin Netanyahu and his efforts to eliminate Hamas by any means necessary.
I would be telling Bibi, finish the job once and for all.
The first thing I said to him when it happened was I said, finish them.
Wipe Hamas off of the map.
And what is Biden doing? Not only is he not helping the Jewish students who are being persecuted, he is launching an initiative to combat so-called Islamophobia.
Not a single candidate expressed any support for providing humanitarian aid to Gaza or even mentioned the more than 10,000 who have been killed there, including thousands of women and children, or the fact that millions of Palestinian civilians have been displaced due to Israel's relentless bombing campaign. Some, however, did hint at also potentially going to war with Mexico, saying this about the southern border.
If someone in the drug cartels is sneaking fentanyl across the border when I'm president, that's going to be the last thing they do. We're going to shoot them stone cold dead.
We'll send special operations in to take out the cartels. We need to go to where they're distributing it, where the supply centers are, and take them out.
What I would tell Bibi is that Israel has the right and the responsibility to defend itself. I would tell him to smoke those terrorists on his southern border, and then I'll tell him as President of the United States, I'll be smoking the terrorists on our southern border.
On top of all that, you had freeform right-wing podcaster Vivek Ramaswamy quite literally calling Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is Jewish, by the way, a Nazi. Real presidential. And then there was the fact that after getting shellacked a mere 24 hours prior in yet another election where abortion rights were on the ballot, you'd think that maybe, just maybe, they would take the hint that Americans do not want abortion bans. Except they didn't. They just went on to talk about banning abortion anyway.
I'm 100% pro-life. I have had 100% pro-life voting record. I would certainly, as President of the United States, have a 15-week national limit. I would not allow states like California, Illinois, or New York to have abortion up until the day of birth.
A pregnant woman walking down the street, she's assaulted. The unborn child dies in that assault. You find me one person in this country who says that that criminal does not deserve liability for that death.
I trust the people of this country, state by state, to make the call for themselves.
Let's find consensus. Let's agree on how we can ban late-term abortions.
This is the message of Republicans in 2024. Control women's bodies and bomb stuff. They have no other governing philosophy. That's just it. That's it. And in the meantime, the elephant who wasn't in the room, Donald Trump, who is almost definitely getting the nomination next year and will fully try to end democracy as we know it, remains unscathed. He also just announced that he won't be at the fourth debate either. So just brace yourself for even more of this nonsense. Joining me now is Cornell Belcher, Democratic pollster, strategist, and MSNBC political analyst, and Stuart Stevens, political strategist and senior advisor to the Lincoln Project. I am going to start with you first, Stuart, because, I mean, what we heard last night in some ways is irrelevant because these people essentially are irrelevant. But to me, what was relevant and why we wanted to play those clips is that it does speak to what they believe the core philosophy of the Republican Party should be. And apparently it is going to war not once, not twice, not just in the Middle East, but also with our neighbor to the south. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess if you're Canadian, you can sleep well tonight, but that might come up in the next debate. You know, this is what happens when, as you said, a party doesn't have any governing philosophy. And that really means it doesn't really have a reason to exist. So it becomes like a sports team where the lunatic fans who run out on the field naked, you know, they're the ones that get the attention. And the thing that really struck me was there was no hint of decency or humanity or kindness at all on that stage. I mean, who are these people that you would say, look, if anything happened to me, I'd like you to take care of my family? And I think that's really an important role of the President of the United States in our system. And, you know, that's something that President Biden does very well. And it's very genuine to him. So I think when you look at this, all this, you know, we're going to bomb Iran, we're going to bomb Mexico, we're going to kill these people. I just think most Americans look at that and they're right. It is a party of losers.
You know what's interesting about that, Cornel, is that, I can remember the late John McCain, he did the joke where he would sing bomb, 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 Iran. You would have Lindsey Graham joke about flattening Iran and going to war with Iran. And this is like a thing, right? So in the Republican Party, we know there is a core of warmongering. That's a part of it. There's a neoliberal version of it, too. Let's just be clear. The Democratic side that weren't unhappy about going to war with Iraq. But one of the reasons that Barack Obama beat John McCain, despite John McCain being a war hero, is that Americans were sick of going into foreign wars. That even Trump voters, one of the things that kind of unites them is the idea that they don't think Trump would put us in World War III. So the idea that these guys think warmongering is the way to win over his voters, to me, seems upside down and backwards. But you're the pollster, so I'll let you weigh in.
Well, I'm going to deconstruct it a little bit more than that, Joy. I mean, there is a fine line between being tough, right? And it's sort of this idea on being tough on crime and being tough on immigration, being tough on terrorism. There's a fine line between being tough and camouflage for hate. And I think they crossed that line at the debate. When you look at the language about shooting people dead and bombing and wiping people off, Joy, that's not about being tough on terrorism. That is crossing the line and becomes a camouflage for hate. And I hate to say it, but you know American history very well. There is a landing space for hate in this country, and hate does mobilize people in this country. We've seen it time and again. I would think, matter of fact, it is the whole predicate of Donald Trump's presidency is that hate. And what I saw on display there is crossing the line. It is not about being tough. It is about hate, right? Camouflage as being tough, and it's hate against, surprise, surprise, a bunch of brown people. So I'm not surprised by that at all.
And by the way, to say to you just a second, Cornel, not only just hate against brown people, because you're right, Iran becomes a surrogate for Muslims. We're going to shoot people in Mexico, and talking about fentanyl becomes a surrogate for brown people south of our border. And to have three non-white people on that stage who were in some ways the most vehement and most vicious about the violence that they would do as president was interesting. And of course, Ron DeSantis, who has already done violence to desperate Venezuelan migrants by going and collecting them from Texas and shipping them off wherever he would, his paid airline flights would take them. That it does feel like maybe that is what they're zeroing in on, is that they've decided that the Republican Party hates people of color, maybe, and that they think if they show that they share in it, that maybe that'll help them.
Well, there is something, I think, there about sharing the values, right? It is, how can I prove that I'm not like one of them? It's like I'm going to double down and be as angry and as hateful towards them as possible. So I do think it is something sort of, how can I get more credibility with the base around these conversations, having to deal with hate and taking on what they, again, sort of camouflage of terrorism. What I really find interesting is that because you don't see the same sort of vitriol, sort of this assiduousness about terrorism when it comes to American terrorism, because over the last decade, the people who've been the biggest terrorists in America is coming from white supremacy. You never hear any of them talking about, oh, I'm going to wipe out white supremacy in this country. You never hear them say, we're going to smoke white supremacy out of this country. In the same way they talk about terrorism in other places. I wonder why that is.
Yeah, and Stuart, the interesting thing is, you have Ron DeSantis up there, and he's in his home turf, who has said nothing as Nazis have marched through the state of Florida. There's been numerous instances. Sometimes they're holding his signs that say they support him. He says nothing about it. And the only time we hear about an opposition to Nazism is Vivek Ramaswamy calling the president of calling Volodymyr Zelensky a Nazi. He's Jewish. So there is this sort of weird play they're doing there. To talk about that a little bit, and also the other theme that I sort of heard last night, especially coming from Tim Scott, is this sort of over the top, I'm the sort of bringer of Christianity to the country. He sort of said he's running to essentially impose a Christian worldview, his particular version of it, on the country.
Yeah, I think Cornel made some great points there. They're sort of rejoicing in violence. Violence should be something that is disturbing, that is used as a last resort, that serious governments look at the use of force like that as a failure of public policy when there's no last resort. And they're going to this as sort of a first resort. And look, I tend to remember that, we went to war in two countries for like 20 years. Do we really do not know what the price of that is, what the reality of that is, what it's done to so many Americans and so many, hundreds of thousands of others in other countries? So there's just, this becomes about this sort of strange emotion that they're trying to connect with people by appealing to their worst sides. Ultimately, a strong country is a country where you feel safe, where you don't have to think about the government. And this intrusiveness about it, it's just really not a group of serious people. And I thought that comment that Ramaswamy made about, the president of Ukraine, a Jewish president, being a Nazi, I had the depressing realization that I've been to over 40 Republican primary debates in my life. And I think that may have been the worst moment in all of them. And let me tell you, there's been some really bad moments before with really ridiculous people. But that was disgraceful. He should drop out of that race. The party should censor him. He should not be on a stage being able to give him a platform for hate speech.
I agree. And ostensibly, he's running to be commander-in-chief and the person who would have to deal with Volodymyr Zelensky. How would he sit across a table from him, having called that Jewish man a Nazi, somebody who is facing an onslaught from Russia, who's trying to invade and occupy his country? How would he even sit across from him? He's not a serious human being.